Okay, good morning. This is Richard Shu, host of Shu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest, Professor Linda Hill, who's the co-founder of two companies, Paradox Strategies and Innovation Force, also a Harvard Business School professor. Linda, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, Linda, let me start by asking you, what is sort of your area of expertise and research? I know you obviously do a lot of different things, but how would you describe that?
So my research is really in three areas: leadership, globalization, and innovation. And I think much of my research these days is on innovation, but I try to make sure when I'm looking at innovation, I do it in a global context. And the focus of my work on innovation is, what do leaders need to do if they want to build companies that can innovate time and again?
And what do leaders need to do if they want to innovate time and again?
Well, one of the things we discovered in our work is that basically leading innovation is different from leading change. All of the leaders we've studied have been visionaries, but they understand when you're leading innovation, it's not so much about saying, I have a vision, communicating that vision and getting people to go or inspire them to fulfill that vision. So it's not about getting people to follow you to the future. It's about creating the environment in which people will be willing to co-create the future with you.
And what are some of those key elements of that environment that needs to be created so that people will do that?
Yes, and actually I should have said willing and able to actually do it, to do the innovation. So what we see is you have to build the right culture to get people to be willing, and then you have to build the right capabilities to get people to be able. So what I would say about the willing is that what you want to work on is, do you have a sense of shared purpose to begin to build a sense of community? Because unless people feel connected to each other and really care about the work, it's not worth taking the risks necessary to do anything that's breakthrough. And that culture of community also has certain sort of values associated with it, and also, if you will, what we call rules of engagement about how you think together and how you actually interact with each other. The other piece of it is the capabilities that make you able to innovate. And this is the part that I don't think most leaders pay enough attention to. And there are really three muscles you have to build. We refer to them as creative abrasion, creative agility, and creative resolution. Creative abrasion really is about the fact that most innovations are the result of a collaboration of individuals with different points of view, different expertise. So when you actually go to innovate and you go to collaborate, the key is, can you actually embrace that diversity of thought, and use it to solve a problem you're trying to solve? Because too often we might have diversity, but we don't embrace it. In fact, we minimize it. And what you see in these organizations is you develop a culture in which you amplify difference. Because the belief is that everybody has a slice of genius, hence we call the book Collective Genius. Everybody in the organization has talents, everybody has passions. And your role as a leader is to figure out how to unleash those talents and those passions, then deal with the conflict that comes from that as you're trying to collaborate to get to the other side, and harness or leverage them for the collective good to fulfill some purpose. So the first one is creative abrasion. The second one is actually creative agility. This is the one that I think most leaders immediately sort of think about. We have to do our work differently. So what you see is lean startup. They come and copy what people do in Silicon Valley. Agile methodologies, design thinking, something that will allow you to act your way as opposed to plan your way to the future. And needless to say, when you're acting, you got to be able to experiment. You got to be able to deal with the inevitable missteps that are going to come with that. And then the final one is creative resolution. And this is how you make decisions. And I got to tell you, decision making is kind of broken in many companies. But if you really want to be able to innovate and be agile, you have to be able to make effective decisions pretty quickly so that you can run those experiments, evaluate what's going on, and run the next one. So what kind of decision making do we see? What we see in these organizations is they understand that fundamentally you have to have a more patient and inclusive way of doing the decision making, so you can take advantage of the diversity of thought, so that you can take advantage of the learning. Having said that, what they also know is you have to be real clear about decision making rights. Everybody needs to know who's going to make the decision. So what you see in these organizations is these leaders make sure that people don't just go along to get along. They don't just compromise, which is quite common because, in fact, most organizations aren't so good at creative abrasion, that diversity of thought. And the second piece of it is you don't let one group dominate. You don't let the bosses dominate, and you don't let the experts dominate. The experts are often quite tied to the status quo, frankly. And so indeed, you actually open it up, beginner's eye to expert, do it in a relatively patient and inclusive way. And I say relatively patient because as you get better at this, it happens quickly. The organizations or teams can get really good at doing this, but initially when you start to try to embrace the diversity and do things in a different way, hear the voices, do the learning, bring that into your decision making, you will slow down. And it comes with practice. So those three muscles, creative abrasion, creating a marketplace of ideas through debate and discourse, creative agility, being able to experiment and learn as efficiently as possible, and then creative resolution, being able to make decisions in a way that you actually use the diversity and the learning is what that's about. And that tends to be more both and decision making, like Roger Martin would have talked about, as opposed to either or.
Now, interesting. So this framework, is this equally applicable to tech companies, product companies, services? I mean, is it broadly applicable, or is it really designed for a certain type of company?
No, very broadly applicable. We have looked at leaders in a whole range of countries and in a whole range of industries and in government and also in the not-for-profit sector. And part of the reason why there are differences, the differences in how you do this stuff reflect both national differences, I think, industry kinds of practices, etc. But really more, I would say, individual differences in leadership style. But what these leaders do and why very similar. So the thing I didn't say is that these leaders understand that you need everyone in the organization to understand that they actually can be an innovator. So one of the organizations we were studying, a big pharma company, and that pharma company, and I think we've all benefited from their work, we studied the Global Clinical Supply Group, led by a man named Michael Koo. So as you all know, Pfizer did the impossible, like a couple of other companies. In 266 days, they got a vaccine. Now, one of the things that had to happen before that, and the leader who was leading that group, he had to convince the people in supply chain that they were innovators and not just the scientists. They needed to innovate on their processes so that actually when an emergency came, and we know which one it was, they had actually been working on their culture and their capabilities for about 6 years, as well as building out the digital tools and data they needed to really drive those trials. And if they hadn't been doing that culture work and the capability work that I've described to you, and they would all tell you this, there's no way they could have run those trials in 266 days.
How did you come up with this interesting framework? I mean, I assume you did this evolve over time, or did it come, how did it happen?
Yeah, the way it happened, and actually where it's continuing to evolve, and there's one other piece to it that I think is really critical today, enabled by technology and data. So it happened because I'm the chair of the Leadership Initiative at Harvard Business School. So one of my responsibilities is to meet with the various deans and ask them, what do we need to be doing to make sure we're developing leaders who can make a difference in the world? That is our purpose. And the dean at the time, now in 1999 or something like that, said to me, Linda, are we preparing leaders who know how to lead innovation? And I said, well, of course we are. We have world experts on innovation like Clay Christensen. We have world experts on leadership like John Cotter. So I said, yeah, I think we must be. But then I realized that the academy is really quite siloed, just like even though I'm at a general management school. And so that the people who study innovation tend to be economists and macro sociologists. And the people who study leadership tend to be more micro. But what we really needed to understand is the connection between the two. So for over 20 years, I've been looking at, what's the connection between leadership and innovation? And frankly, when we started the research, we began by studying companies like Pixar, eBay, because that was hot, Google, these companies that were, many of them digital first, or where technology was very important. Did study some companies like Volkswagen, Audi, some others as well, but HCL Technologies in India, an Indian outsourcing company at the time. But really, it was about leaders who kind of were leading in organizations that had built from the start to be quite innovative, to understand what are these leaders doing. And that's when we began to see, even though they were all visionaries, that wasn't their focus. Their focus was on creating an environment, culture and capabilities. So I'm an ethnographer. I use the methods of anthropology, and I do longitudinal studies of people, usually a minimum of 5 years and sometimes 8, 9 years, because culture change takes time and capability building. So anyway, we did that book, and it was called Collective Genius. And for the reasons I said, there's these slices of genius, talent, and passion. How do you unleash and harness them? After we finished that book, and I'm a little pokey, I wanted to have my new book, or our new book, I should say, out last year. But when COVID happened, I said to my colleagues, we need to stop and collect data about COVID. How can we have a book come out in 2022 that doesn't talk about COVID? So we stopped and collected the data. And then when you do that, of course, you see other things too. But what we were doing starting about 7 years ago, because of also the digital and the data, and we began to look at digital transformation and how that the role that was playing in innovation. And we began to study mostly incumbents who were trying to transform themselves to be more agile and innovative, as opposed that were sort of started out that way, if you will, the companies I described in the first study. So this book is called Scaling Genius, or will be called Scaling Genius, because what we see now is innovation. To do it, you can't just do it inside your own company. It's not just about your own environment, right? Your own culture and capabilities, because what we need to reach beyond our boundaries to get the talent and tools we need inside our companies to do what we need to do. So the first book is about how do you be a leader as an architect. In this book, we're looking at how you architect nowadays and how technology is helping with that. But we're also looking at how do you become a bridger, learn how to co-create with people beyond your boundary. Or even more so, how do you create the whole ecosystem necessary to support the kind of innovation you want to do on behalf of your customers and your companies? So we see leaders having to support, you need to figure out, how do I facilitate a multi-party collaboration between, those companies over there, because we need that capability in our company to do what we want to do. So that is, I think what's happening is that formal authority has never been that useful when it comes to innovation. You can only invite people. You cannot tell them you will innovate. Doesn't happen that way, right? So at first it was about the environment inside your company. So how do you get them to, or your team or whatever? But now, as I look at MasterCard, when it made its move to become a global tech company, they knew that they could never buy everything they needed to buy to do what they wanted to do if they were going to be a tech company in payments. Or you look at Microsoft. Microsoft doesn't own ChatGPT. You have to partner with them, right? So again, you've got to learn how to build partnerships, how to build the social fabric of these ecosystems so that people will be willing and again, of course, able to want to partner with you to do what is always emotionally and intellectually difficult work. Breakthrough innovation is not easy.
Interesting. Let me go back to a concept you talked about earlier at the beginning. We talked about shared sense of purpose, how important that is. What are some of the key elements of making sure that there is a shared sense of purpose? Because that's a common theme I hear a lot from other, leadership people.
Yeah, it's very funny when, and I'm going to just back up a little bit. When we wrote Collective Genius, purpose popped out. And this was back in 2014. I mean, we've been doing more research and publishing articles since then, but purpose was like so, and that's not, people weren't talking a whole lot about purpose. I don't think you discover stuff is out there, but, and we saw though, if there wasn't that sense of shared purpose, nothing happened. And so I'm not at all surprised that now that innovation is so critical to be competitive, there's a focus on purpose, because you are trying to get that stickiness, that bond. So one of the things, frankly, the way that most of the companies we see do it is literally by getting to know their customers very well. We call it customer intimacy. So the way that literally the practice is something that forces you as an organization in mixes, maybe not traditional, cross-functional, cross-geography, to really visit with your customer and know them. And then you all begin, and once you have an intimate understanding of the customer. So going back to the Pfizer example, Michael, he thought we're going to be patients first. I need to build a patients first digital and physical supply chain, global supply chain. And you would think, and it's not that people didn't care about the patient, but frankly, they were focused on how do we make sure we get these vials to the hospital or the pharmacist so they can give the shot, right? Or give the medicine or whatever it was to the patient. Instead, he said, let's all get together. Let's go visit patients in their homes who are in these trials and understand what really they are going through. So their purpose became delivering hope. So then when the vaccine needed to be, among other things, there were a lot's going on during COVID for this group. I'm just pulling out the COVID vaccine. One of the things they all knew was, and what he could say is, now we're all patients. We have to deliver hope to all of us. So our ambition. So again, the connection, empathizing, really, really understanding and going to the end-to-end experience, not just the vial, but what's the experience of the patient, what's going on in their home that we need to take into account when these trials are being run. how do we make it easier? They're very busy in hospitals, so people are helping us run these trials. How do we make it really easier for them to make sure they're giving exactly the right dose at the right time to these various patients? Turns out, you know what? They had some innovation around color coding. Right. Color is easier than it. So they were able, when they had to run the vaccine trials, they ran, I think 4 different formulations, 3 different dosages. That's a lot of complexity for a pharmacist to have to handle to give to a patient. So they went to, in a way, I guess I would say, and they went from being sort of B to B to being B to B to C. You got to go to the end consumer, because it's very rare that we get all excited about the B, when people, the meaningfulness of the work. Right. When you actually remind people of the C, and you get to know what the hopes, dreams, and pain points of that C, that consumer, that tends to be, that's what I see most leaders using to get people to say, gee, I really care about these people, or whatever it is. And now that I really know them, and we know them together, again, customer intimacy is what we call it, then we're trying to solve their problems. So at Procter & Gamble, they said, we're not, fall in love with the problem of the consumer. Don't fall in love with your solution.
Yeah, interesting.
That's how they go about it. It's really through the work. Yeah, I guess it's not like putting up a big plaque and saying, oh, this, patients first, or it's more about, let's interact with who we serve and then understand who they are. And boy, tends to make our work much more meaningful. I now see how what I do on the line manufacturing this stuff relates to, again, delivering hope is what became their purpose.
Yeah. Tell me about your new company, this Innovation Force. You just started and won a recent award. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I love being a professor, because our students are always smarter than us. So both of the companies that I helped co-found were started by former students. So Innovation Force is really, we're trying to create a platform to help the utilities, people in energy, where the first use cases are in utilities. They have all kinds of goals for, as you know, sustainability that need to happen. And to get to those, to achieve those goals, they need to be able to innovate. So we have created kind of a dashboard, I would say, that has both hard and soft of what you need to pay attention to actually know if you're making progress towards innovation. So many of these, we were working together. It's a very diverse team. We are bringing to it, how do you measure culture capabilities? How do you know whether people are engaged on the things they need to be engaged? How are you dealing with the fear? Have you had that sense of community? Because without that, even if you have all the latest, operational model processes in place, if people, or even if you have all the data and all the digital tools, people don't use those things, is what we hear from many companies, unless you have the right culture and capabilities. So what gets assessed over time, in real time, is where you are on this, so that everybody can have a sense of, this is where we are now. These are the priorities of what we need to work on given where we are now, both in terms of the quote hard and soft. And then that will help. We've worked very closely with, energy companies, a whole range of them, to figure out what really are the factors that make a difference. And there is an AI and machine learning play that we've been engaged in, and looking at data to figure out what really matters. What are the indicators you need to really pay attention to?
Is your concepts of innovation, is that something that you think can really be taught, or is that something, people tend to think of leadership qualities as kind of an innate thing, or do you think that can really be taught to somebody who's not, a natural leader, for however that's maybe defined?
So one of the things we're definitely capturing in all the data we're collecting for this book as well is how these leaders have evolved and transformed themselves. So as I said, being the head of the leadership initiative, we do research on how people learn to lead. I particularly do research on how stars learn to lead, because stars actually have more trouble learning to lead, as it turns out. But one of the things I would say is, you can't teach anybody how to lead. You can only help them teach themselves how to lead. It's a self-development process, because leadership is about using yourself as an instrument to get things done. You're the instrument, and you have to be willing to work on yourself. But I was in a conversation with a very senior executive, president of a major organization, and we were talking about actually diversity and equity and inclusion. And long story short, I ended up saying to him, and not in a snide way, but because he was telling me about, how people get to be stars in his organization. And I said, well, looks like, did you see the movie Baby Boss? Were you like born a CEO? Like how did it happen? Right. Mm-hmm. Because fundamentally, many people think leaders are born, not made. Yeah. Right. And so I said, let's think about how, in fact, you learned to do what you are doing and why. And as you go through that process and go through a person's career with them, you discover the following truths. One, what you know is based on what you get to do. If you don't get to do it, you cannot learn it. We're very practical learners. We learn in context, right? Mm-hmm. Two, what you get to do is based on who you know. So it goes back to your network and who trusts you and who's going to bet on your potential. So you got to have someone to bet on your potential to give you those stretch assignments. And stretch assignments have 3 qualities to them. One, you're working on something that's very relevant to the current, what's going on in the company now or to the future. You also have some autonomy, so you can sort of play out, some of what you think and how you need to do it. And then you do need visibility. I will say that's the last piece of it, because you need to build credibility over time with whoever you're trying to deal with, because if they're not credible, they're not going to give you that next stretch assignment. And so I think that to answer your question, I know there are many people out there who are not up to or not willing and able to develop themselves. There's lots of research on how you do help people with that, but you never teach someone how to lead. You actually help them. You give them a set of experiences. You help them develop a set of relationships, or you're one of the relationships, which is why we see so many leaders having coaches these days. But it is a process of self-development. And with regard to innovation, at Procter & Gamble, much to the credit of the C-suite, they hired a coach who basically came in and counted how many times they asked questions versus how many times they made statements. They ended up creating a script for themselves where they said, when someone comes in and presents, an innovative project we're supposed to be working on or something, we need to ask, what have you learned? How did you learn it? What else do you need to learn? How can I help? Those are not the questions they used to ask initially when people would come in with ideas. Another chairman of Sony, he said that he got into the habit of, I didn't speak for the first 20 minutes because if I spoke, everyone said, we agree with you.
Right.
No diversity of thought. So again, these micro behaviors and managing those to create, as my colleague says, psychological safety on the one hand, so that people will really tell you what they think. We've collected data on about 150 organizations with regard to creative abrasion and agility and resolution and the cultural pieces too. But it turns out it's harder to build the capabilities and culture, as I said. But many, many companies have trouble with creative abrasion. That is marketplace of ideas through debate and discourse. So it's not accidental we start off by brainstorming when there's, quote, no evaluation. You need to do that. But then eventually, if you really want a robust pipeline of ideas, you got to rub those ideas up against each other. You have to confront each other. You have to ask questions. And otherwise, you're not going to de-risk them, and amongst a whole other set of things that won't happen if you just go with what people first say. So that skill is, most organizations aren't good at it. I mean, when we collect it, and if you're not good at that, then you're not going to be so good at decision making, right? So these things are very connected.
Yeah. Of all the things that you do, teaching, research, writing, starting companies, I assume you do like consulting and speaking and stuff like that. What is kind of your favorite of all the various things you do?
My favorite thing is learning from other people. That's my favorite thing. And so, and all those different venues, they're all connected to me because, theory and practice, to me, the connection of the two, the fact that I can step back and look at across a lot because I am a professor, and on the other hand, trying to use it in a context. So my collaborators, whenever I'm doing work, include 2 types of people. One, a young person. And so the last book I wrote and the one I'm writing now, there's a woman, turns out they were both women, both named Emily, as it turns out. But my co-author is a 20-something-year-old, right? Because I want that young point of view, somewhat more of the beginner's eye, collecting data, analyzing data with me. The second person I always have, or 2 people usually, it depends on what we're doing, are actually executives who basically are like, Linda, how do you use this? Or, is this parsimonious enough? Do we give the big picture, but then the practical? So I've had 3 people, one who was fundamentally, he was a senior vice president, kind of like a chief technology officer of Pixar. The second was Tim Colby, who designed the Apple stores and the Tesla stores and the Virgin Lounges. And the third is Jason Wild, who I met actually in probably 2010 or something like that, when he was at IBM, and he was a relatively young, person in the company. And we just loved each other. He's not even named in the book because the editor told me, you can't put the names of everybody. And so these young people know. I think it's funny now he'll be on the front of the book because he's on Scaling Genius, but he went from IBM, he went to Salesforce for a while, then he's gone to Microsoft recently. So I always, having those three people who are in business and have been in businesses that, are changing the world or big and et cetera, truly helps me look back, and we have creative abrasion.
Interesting.
They tear out like, Linda, I don't know. I don't think it works quite that way. I didn't experience it that way. Or that language is not the right rhetoric to use. And so we push and pull on each other. And, can you imagine? I have a dream team, and the two Emilys are brilliant.
Yeah.
I should have said Emily Truelove and Emily Tedderts. So they're spectacular young people. Emily Truelove is a little older now, and she's actually become a professor at Harvard Business School because we wrote that stuff a while ago. But yeah, Emily Tedderts is right now, she's just a first year PhD. We started working together about 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, Linda, I really appreciate you taking the time. You came super highly recommended by one of my previous guests, and it was just great to talk to you. And I really appreciate your taking this time.
Well, it's really wonderful to be with you, and I've enjoyed listening to your other podcasts.
This is Richard Hsu and Linda Hill. Thanks.